Today's reading is taken from the New International Version, Ecclesiastes, from the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Again, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace.
A number of years ago, probably more years than many of us would like to think about, a rock group called the Byrds put out a song called Turn, Turn, Turn. And the words of the song, other than the words turn, 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 basically came from Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 8. For a lot of young people who were really kind of excited by the song, they really liked it, thought it was great, had no idea that it came from the Bible. Yet for those who came from backgrounds that were familiar with the Bible, they were excited to hear the words of a passage that they had grown up with that was being played to a young generation. I want to take some time this morning to think about this passage and think about some ideas related to it. This would be the last of what you might think of as the New Year's kind of messages, but I thought this would be a good thing to stop and talk about this morning. Now, just always a bit of explanation about Ecclesiastes as we get started. The book of Ecclesiastes doesn't identify the writer by name, but refers to him as the teacher. And what it says, that he was the son of David, king in Jerusalem. He was a son of another descendant of David. And that he was a possessor of great wisdom and knowledge. And so the finger kind of points to Solomon as a very strong possibility as the author. But what makes Ecclesiastes really interesting is that it is the one book of the Bible that really takes a look at things from our perspective, which means it can get a little depressing at times because of that. But what the writer says, that he set out to explore what was under the heavens and uses different expressions, life under the sun or under heaven. In other words, it's our view of things, what we see and what we experience. And as we live, and we'll talk more about this, under God and His sovereignty. The writer tries to be a little, I would say a little scientific in his approach to things in terms of saying, I tried to experiment. And I tried to find out where I could find meaning and purpose in life. And where I could find answers. And he looked at pleasure, and he looked at wealth, and looked at power, and found that was just not a satisfying answer to everything. And so, as you think about life under heaven, here's some things that he said. He said, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. It kind of gives you a bit of an example of the pessimism of the book. You know, as it looks at our lives from the standpoint that we're only here for a short time. You know, it may seem longer at times, but the reality is those of us who are, you know, at the later stages of life, realize that it's been a very short time since we were teenagers. And those of us who are teenagers, you know, they look at the old folks and they think, well, we've been around forever, but it doesn't work that way. So, chapter 1. I devoted myself to study and explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. Look what he says. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I've seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What he's talking about here is the fact that it seems like no matter what happens, we always come back to the same thing. And for him, it's a really discouraging idea. Is that he's wealthy, he's powerful, he has fame, you know, has all those things that human beings seem to want. But as he considers that the poor fool is going to die the same death that he does. And that all of these things that he has and all of these things that he's done ultimately end in the same place, in the grave. Now that makes him really pretty, you know, bummed out, if you can use the expression. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? I mean, you think about it. You know, people spend their lives acquiring, accumulating, accomplishing. But when we die, from the purely physical standpoint, all that's left of us is our memories. And as the writer thinks about this, then he realizes, okay, I'm a really wealthy person, and when I die, I lose it all. And who knows whether the one who inherits everything that I've accomplished is going to be a fool and is going to blow it in a day. And you kind of want to mess your mind up, you know, you think about that. Don't look at your kids that way, but just kind of think about the fact that everything that you will accomplish in life may turn out for nothing in the end, because you're going to die. We all are going to die. And so he says there's nothing new under the sun. Everything, chapter 2, 11, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. One of the things that I suggest when I do a study, you know, get into a class and teach a class about Ecclesiastes, is that, you know, you find a man here who is really struggling with the nature of his life, and he's not liking the answer. That is, that as he looks at just what life is like in its own, on its own, just from a worldly standpoint, that the answers he keeps coming back to are depressing and frustrating. And there's a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness that seems to come with that. In chapter 9, verse 11, he says that time and chance happen to them all. You know that there are things that happen in our lives that are totally beyond our control. One of them is aging. That's time. And for those who are older, we cannot do what we used to do, right? Or at least we do it slower. That's the nature of life. But then there's chance. And you know what's interesting here is this, the Hebrew word that's used here is only used 2 times in the Old Testament. And the other time that it's used with the idea of a mishap. And so maybe even think about that negative chance happens. You go out in your car and somebody crashes into you. Somebody gets sick. Maybe even a terminal illness. That the nature of life is that it seems like we're out of control. We don't have control of things. And we're just the victims. So time, life are limited. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, we return to the dust. We're not in control. And so the beginning of this chapter, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun. That as the preacher, the writer, is considering the nature of his life, he realizes that there's a balance that happens. Sometimes we think of it in other ways, but just kind of look at this list that he goes through in these 8 verses. Okay, birth and death. I mean, that's kind of the ultimate symbols of the nature of our life. We come into the world, we leave it. There's a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down, time to build, time to weep, time to laugh, time to mourn, grieve, a time to dance, celebrate, a time to scatter, a time to gather, time to embrace or to refrain from embracing, a time to search, time to give up. I always laugh at this one because those that know me know that when I'm looking for something, I don't give up. But there's a time to give up, time to keep, time to throw away, time to tear, time to mend, time to be silent, time to speak, time to love, time to hate, time for war, and a time for peace. Now, he's not necessarily saying that all of these are desirable things. I think we need to keep that in mind. But these are things that happen in life. Things that we have to deal with. So, in a sense, this is a list of life events. We could also look at this as a list of contrasts, of opposites. You know, life, death. But there's something else here that I don't know if you've ever thought about it. It's a list of choices. You know, that all of these, except for life and death, although even in death, sometimes people choose to die. You know, you didn't choose to be born, that happened. But yet, you think about all of the things in the other verses, that those are choices that we make. Those are decisions that we have. That God has given us the ability to make choices and decisions. And so we can choose to plant. And we can choose when to harvest. Now, a farmer would tell you that they know by the seasons, the calendar, the conditions, when it's time to do those things. And yet, the specific decision to act is in their hand. But the one thing that stands out in looking through Ecclesiastes is that there are consequences to our actions. That if we choose certain things, so you go down that list in verses 1 through 8, there are certain things in there that if we do them, there are going to be net results. And there's a passage I want to use as an example, where he says in chapter 7, he says, "Don't be over wicked and do not be a fool. Why die before your time?" In other words, that sometimes people, you go out and get in your car, you speed down the streets, with the ice on them. And, given a normal circumstance, you might live to 80 or 90 years these days. But you may not make it past 30 if you're young because of foolish choices that are made. And so, while God has given us the ability to make choices and to make decisions, that those have results and those have consequences. So I want to just kind of stir your thinking here at the beginning of the year to think about, well, what time is it? Time for Turner to quit. No. What time is it? I mean, as you look at all of those ideas, all of those decisions, all of those choices that he's listed in these verses, you think about that there are so many things, there's so many options that we have that God has enabled us to choose. Now, one thing, and I thought, okay, I got to include this point, that there never is a time to sin or to disobey God. Now, that's not what the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, although you could imply that in the fact that is something that happens in life. I mean, we all make bad choices, and we all have consequences that we'd rather not face, right? But in terms of what the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, is that as he goes through thinking about the meaning and purpose of life, and I'll just go ahead and kind of tell you the conclusion of the book, is that what he says is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole of man. That the idea of living life under the sun is that we recognize that we are creations of God, that he has set, as the writer of Ecclesiastes puts it, he has set eternity in our hearts. We have something that yearns for meaning, for purpose, for fellowship, of being part of something greater than we are. It's interesting to me that as you look from just look at humanity over all of the centuries and through the whole world today, is that people are always looking for something to invest their lives in. Now, in our culture, there are many people who do that in terms of self. And that kind of is a dead end. But for so many people in the world, they have looked for some concept of God. Something that they can serve. Something that they can worship. So it's time for us to make the most of life. That's really what the writer of Ecclesiastes comes down to make the most of life. But it's not about our things. It's not about our fame, not about our power, not about our pleasure. But it's the meaning and the purpose that God brings to us. I think the thing that stands out about this chapter is that as you look down the list, you know what's not in that list? A time to sit. A time to do nothing. That everything there is about doing something. And I think the message of it is to say, we need to do. We need to act. And the most important thing we can do is to respond to God. That's what he concludes, the end of the matter. Fear God. Not the idea of being terrified by the idea of God, but the idea is that we honor and we respect and we serve God. And we recognize, we give him the first place in our lives. So for the writer of Ecclesiastes, that's the most important thing that he could do. That he explored all of these things to find meaning and purpose, and they came up empty. And so as we go through those opening chapters of the book, he keeps repeating, all is vanity in the older translations. New translations will say meaningless, emptiness, pointless. We could add purposelessness. That's why he says the end of the matter is God. That's why we're here. That's how we got here. And that's what we will not find fulfillment until we know him. We're going to be singing a song just a minute to encourage each one of us. But if you're not a Christian yet, I want to encourage you to think about your relationship with God. And if we can help you with that, you can talk with Chad or talk with me or one of the elders afterward. Maybe as a Christian, you have not really been using the time. You've been kind of living clueless. You don't know what time it is. Yeah. One of the interesting passages in the New Testament is in 2 Corinthians, where Paul said, today is the day of salvation. Being right with God is not something that we want to put off to another time. But it's always time to be right with God. Let's stand as we sing.